Fire Trap of Blasting is pretty criminally underrated right now. However, this isn't without reason. Initially, when the skill was first revealed, there were some problems with the AoE of it. It did genuinely seem like the skill just did not scale AoE at all. And if the ability wasn't going to be able to overlap with something like Cluster Traps or Sunblast, then it really just wasn't going to be a good ability. Why would you ever play an ability with such small AoE compared to something like Explosive Trap? However, what myself and quite a couple other people have figured out is that this is just a visual bug. But either way, it doesn't actually affect the ability at all. Fire Trap of Blasting is a pretty massively powered skill, with some of the highest built-in damage to a single ability that I think I've ever seen. Now, if we take a look quickly at normal Fire Trap, you'll notice it has this line down at the bottom that says added fire damage against burning enemies. And this amount of burning damage is relatively small. However, it makes up for that with a very good amount of base damage as well as some damage over time. However, when we look at Fire Trap of Blasting, it has a much smaller base damage, however, significantly more added fire damage against burning enemies. And one of the key takeaways here is the fact that this is added fire damage. If you take a look at the effectiveness of added damage on this ability, it is 260%, and that added fire damage against burning enemies is affected by that. On top of that, Fire Trap of Blasting also has this line that says 50% chance for trap to trigger an additional time. Now, this isn't exactly 50% more damage, however, this is a very, very good thing for uptime. It means that if you're running around, no matter how many traps that you're throwing and you have to do something else, this gives you a 50% chance that the trap will trigger again and do more damage while you're doing essentially nothing. With all of these things combined, we have one of the hardest hitting traps in the game. Now, if you're looking at the character in the background, it is horrifically scuffed. I have some like level 12 and 13 gems, not all of my gems are even proper ones, and I'm doing less than half of the damage that I'm supposed to be doing. I just kind of threw together what I could with the league essentially being as dead as it ever will be. However, even with that, and not with absolutely insane gear, we're able to do some pretty significant damage. Going upwards of roughly 40 million is what's possible with some pretty basic gear. On top of that, this archetype does have quite a bit of potential to go in one of two ways. You can either go a more tanky route where you're able to get a pretty good amount of damage, probably 50, 60 million at most if you want to stay relatively tanky, or you can go the absolute complete opposite way and get hundreds of millions of damage and essentially have no life pool whatsoever. Trappers are one of the best ZHP bossers in the entirety of the game. Another thing is that this ability is actually quite powerful for League Start, and I've been doing some testing recently, able to get under 9 hours on Eater and Exarch, and that was with a pretty suboptimal setup in SSF Fresh Start. If you're interested in more League Start stuff about this build, make sure to stick around to the end of the video because I'll be talking about it then. Now, if you're new to the channel, make sure that you subscribe, and without further ado, let's get into it. Alright boys, so we're going to be doing a couple things in this video. We're going to be going over Fire Trap at a basic level, like the gear and kind of the skeleton of this character, and how I'm most likely going to be testing a bunch of other traps with this almost exact setup. The one big positive of this setup in general is just the fact that it's scaling a bunch of generic damage, a bunch of generic trap damage. So I'll be able to test this on, I think we're gonna do Explosive Trap of Shrapnel, probably Ball Lightning Traps, Ice Trap, and then maybe one or two other things. We'll just see how everything feels. It has been a very long time since I've played traps, so I want to get some like hands-on experience with everything. I know the current meta is like Ice Traps at the super high end for bossing, and Explosive Traps are pretty popular as well, but I want to do some testing of my own. We're also going to run a map. I'll show you how the build functions. We'll talk about Sunblast a little bit, and then I'll talk about the League Start stuff. So first off, let's start with Fire Trap. So there are a couple peculiarities when it comes to Fire Trap. You might notice that I have these two little skitter bots here, and they are on fire. This is because with Fire Trap of Blasting, you do need to have the enemy burning to have its like largest source of damage. So you do need to overcome that. That's a little bit of a downside, is that you need some source of burning. Now, this also does cause us an issue with the fact that we're not really able to use a fire mastery because they have to be burning, and crit is basically our main way to guarantee that something is burning right now, besides these skitterbots. So that is one downside here. The other downside is that when it comes to clear, I actually do think the trap is fine. Like, you can get a lot of these out at one time, and then because we're a sabo, they'll all explode simultaneously. This is because of our ascendancy node that we've got here, which is chain reaction. So the clear isn't too bad. You'll see some more of that when I'm actually doing the map. Now, as I stated previously, there is a visual bug here. So this explosion is significantly larger than it looks. Like it's covering like this much area. It's pretty large because I do have a decent amount of AoE scaled with Sabo, but as I said, that's pretty much it for like the peculiarities or downsides of this. However, we can still talk a little bit about Sunblast in general because this is kind of core to the build. Now, Sunblast does introduce some pretty interesting problems for the build in the fact that you can't use anything that says gain when traps are triggered. Like you might notice in the charge trap support that says chance to gain a power and frenzy charge when your trap is triggered by an enemy. That's pretty common, and it's one of the main ways that you scale just useful mods on trap builds. Sunblast gives you essentially tripled damage, but takes away all of that utility. So we need to get around that. On top of that, it does make it so that your traps cannot be triggered by enemies ever, but they do trigger after about a second with a max rolled Sunblast. Now, on a normal trapper that isn't a saboteur, unfortunately, this means that those traps are only going to trigger after a second. It's going to kind of cascade through them, right? Like it's going to be like every however long in between traps that you throw. However, with a saboteur, if we throw a whole bunch of these traps, as soon as the first one procs, essentially all of them will proc. These are the repeats that you might be seeing from the built-in fire trap of blasting. Because we have this node, we have a lot easier time doing clear. Because typically, you know, you'd have to wait, it would go boom, 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 but instead like 3/4 of them explode immediately and then they explode again. So this covers a lot of the bases with Sunblast, so it's not too terrible. However, something like Explosive Trap of Shrapnel would have significantly more AoE. And if you're interested in Explosive Trap in general, I will be making a video probably dedicated to Explosive Trap and Explosive Trap in general, so make sure to look forward to that in the coming days. Now, talking a bit about the gear here, this is a pretty standard just power charge scale setup, and realistically, none of these items are like unobtainable. For a somewhat experienced player about a week into the league, you should be able to gather most of these items. Maybe not with some of the corruptions, but you should be able to get them just as base items. Some of these are contested, but they're not really insanely rare. It's not like they're tier 1 or tier 0 rarity or anything like that. These are tier 2 and below. So the vast majority of these should be pretty much obtainable. Beyond that, when it comes to the jewels, we're only really using like a basic Militant Faith. We don't care about the number on here at all, just resistances, area damage, and the fact that it's Dominus. You don't even have to go for the area damage, it's just kind of a bonus. I'm using just some double crit multi-life jewels. You can get stats on them if you want. You could do 1 crit multi if it's super early and you can't get those jewels. And then a Watcher's Eye. I'm only using the evade chance on here. I don't have Purity of Elements or Pride, so it is what it is. So this gear is by no means completely unobtainable. However, there is this one item in my inventory which I think is extremely powerful for this build, but this might be a little bit unobtainable early on. I have no idea how this is going to go. It depends on how many people are corrupting these. But the whole point here is that this is a source of blocking spell damage. With this helmet on, with +1 power charges, we would have 10 power charges, meaning that we're getting 50% chance to block spell damage. That means half of spells just aren't going to hit us. We have spell suppression with this 50% spell block, as well as resistances and everything else. We shouldn't have issues with most things in general here. However, this might be a little tough to obtain. In the meantime, you could use a just random crafted helmet such as this, which is super easy to make. Now let's go ahead and do a map. I have a tier 16 map here, just a Veritania map. I just grabbed something from my stash. So I can show you a little bit of the peculiarities when it comes to Sunblast. So when we go into the map, and you'll see almost immediately what I'm talking about, is as we move around and as we try to kill things, yeah, it takes a moment for the damage to go off. However, the damage is large enough that we don't really need to worry too much about like backtracking and going over those enemies. However, you will notice that you kind of just have to trust that the trap is going to do its damage. You can overthrow a little bit, so just like knowing that you have the coverage, knowing that you have enough of those traps out there. But it hits pretty hard, and most things are burning because of our skitterbots that are burning here. The AoE radius on this is pretty large, so we don't have too much of an issue. The main thing that you need to worry about here is just kind of changing your perspective on how you play the game, right? Typically, when you see enemies, you're going to target them and you're going to attack them with whatever you have, like whatever skill that you're using. Here, you're going to kind of need to understand that the enemies are going to be chasing you, and you kind of need to throw it in their path. It's just a like framing issue, so if you change the way that you're thinking about it a little bit, it does kind of become second nature, and it's really not as big of a deal as people make it out to be. Like, people always say that Sunblast feels terrible, but every time I've played with Sunblast, as long as your build is tanky enough to not worry about getting hit a couple of times, you really don't have any issues. The main real issue, I think, here is just the fact that the AoE isn't massive on this ability. It's good, and I think it's big enough, but I think there might be some better choices when it comes to like a mapping skill or like a mapping ability when it comes to traps. Particularly, Explosive Trap of Shrapnel is pretty massive, so that's probably going to be a little bit better of an option, but we'll figure that out in the coming days whenever I start diving into Explosive Trap in general. Let's go ahead and cut to the boss. Oh, I think we're actually already here. So I can show you a little bit of what I'm talking about when it comes to single target. So we'll go ahead and curse, drop down some extra traps, and throw our traps out, and do a ton of damage, right? So we hit extremely hard, even with my super scuffed setup with like, we're at level 16 gems now. Our Fire Trap of Blasting is still level 19. We have like, I think 7 or 8 million more DPS if I just leveled that up to 21, but we'll go ahead here. Now, pre-throwing traps is a little bit rough here because the boss may not actually, you know, we're not going to benefit from a lot of stuff. But as you can see, even without doing that, I mean, the damage is pretty huge. Like, I'm only doing 16, 17 million DPS in POB, but we're kind of like 2 or 3 shotting a tier 16 boss. We also have Enfeeble. I didn't even know Enfeeble was on this map, to be honest with you, so we lost a bunch of damage there. So overall, some pretty good damage. Now, I have included the basic layout of the POB that I'm using for the character that you've seen here. By no means is this a finalized POB in any shape or form. This is just kind of where I think the logical conclusions come from the build that I've made so far and the setup that I've made so far with these items. You'll find a couple different sets of late game gear. These are minor changes to like Will Clash and some corrupted stuff. You'll find like a very early set of gear that overcomes some of the issues of Sunblast, like we're using Jaws of Agony to generate power charges very early on. This gives us Bear Trap and some like life and damage and stuff like that, so it's not a bad shield by any means, but this is our source of power charges very early on. Using a lightning coil because it just lines up a little bit better with the colors of our gems, and we have a bunch more rare items, which means we'll have a lot easier access to resistances. That's actually the main reason that we swapped a Cloak of Flames later on. It's also easier to get a corruption on here because this is a much more common item and a much lower level. But the fact that this has plus 70 fire resistance in comparison to minus 60 lightning resist, when we're on our super high-end version of the gear, we don't have a lot of rares anymore. We're using mostly unique, so resistances are kind of at a premium, so that makes it a little tough to be able to fit anything. However, beyond that, we've got a couple of basic trees, like we've got a couple sets of awakened gems. I'll clean these up before I actually post it down below, but there's not going to be any notes. The configuration should be set pretty well, but this is a very basic POB that you should be able to get an idea of it's something you're interested in for League Start. Now, speaking of League Start, I did say that I would talk a little bit about it. I am going to be doing some League Start testing, and there's a chance that I'm live right this second up in the top right corner now on YouTube as well as Twitch, testing out this build. If I'm not, then you'll probably get a link to the VOD that's up there so you can at least see how everything went. But I'm going to be doing some League Start testing, probably some SSF start testing where I farm the gem is most likely what I'm going to be doing. We'll see how that goes. I'm not exactly sure, but I'm going to be doing that for a various amount of builds, so come and check that out if you're interested in an actual like pure SSF League Start scenario. So we have a couple other traps that we're going to be testing out. Explosive Trap and Explosive Trap of Shrapnel are definitely next on the list. I'm going to be using this same skeleton for most of these builds. We'll see how it goes. I think that clear-wise, Explosive Trap of Shrapnel looks completely unbeatable at this point, so that's probably where we're headed next. So remember, boys, if you enjoy this content, make sure to give this video a like, subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit that notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest videos, and stay safe out there in raid class, and I'll see you guys in the next video.